Welcome to today's Crucial Conversation. My name is John, based here in South Africa with the GRLI. It's my privilege to say a few words of welcome before we get into the conversation itself. And maybe also just provide a little bit of context for those who are joining a Crucial Conversation, previously called Courageous Conversations. For those joining this for the first time or who have perhaps not yet had a chance to engage in one of the GRLI's conversations or initiatives. Very briefly, the Globally Responsible Leadership Initiative is a collaborative inquiry into the development of global responsibility. It's very much an action-oriented, hands-on global community that has been around now for just over 2 decades, and that has held the question around the development of global responsibility in a very engaged and passionate way. As a result of asking questions about how we learn and facilitate learning, how we live and make a living, and how we lead and for what purpose, has been instigating, incubating, catalyzing, supporting various actions, initiatives aimed at transforming business and management education at a systemic level. The Globally Responsible Leadership Initiative is held by a number of partners, of which a few are represented on today's call, and also has a strategic partnership with WECOS International, the student network, with AACSB, EFMD, and was co-founded by EFMD and the United Nations Global Compact. So that gives you a little bit of context just on GRLI. The Crucial Conversations, previously called Courageous Conversations, for those of you that have been to these events in the past, were started around 3 years ago. The idea was to host questions and inquiries that will bring together a variety of voices that follows a relatively unique format in that we typically have about 25 to 30 minutes set aside for so-called conversation starters. And that will be slightly different because we don't have a specific named conversation starter, but we do have our long-standing conversation hosts, Lana, Jalenji, and Chris Taylor on the call will support us with this. In the first 25 to 30 minutes, we hear from the conversation starters in conversation with each other. So it's not a traditional panel per se. And then we take around 30 minutes to break out for a small group conversation. And then we come back for an open space, basically free for all plenary conversation. Today will be slightly different. And I'm going to hand over to Chris and Lana to set us up for my colleague Daria Maletic, who looks after our ecosystem stewardship work. Will be controlling the Zoom technicalities from the background. Thank you very much, Daria. Over to Lana and Chris.
Thanks, John. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you. Nice to have an intimate group to start the conversation today. We've been looking forward to this as a way for us as a group to set the tone and direction of the next 2 conversations. We wanted to make this a more co-creative process than we have done in the past by starting from the topics that the network has put forward and having the discussion today about where we want to take that conversation. The format today is we're going to break out into 2 small groups just to introduce ourselves, get to know each other a little bit, just to relax into the space somewhat. And then we're going to come back together and I'll introduce the topics that the network has suggested: crisis, power, and systemic transformation. We'll have a little introduction to those topics and then go back into breakout groups to deepen our understanding and then bring those back into the whole group. And at that point, we're going to try a technique called a fishbowl, which some of you may have been involved in live, in person, some of you may have been involved on Zoom, and it allows 4 people to start having a conversation with each other and for the rest to observe that conversation as if they were fish in a fishbowl. And then if you want to step into the conversation, you can step in and one other person steps out. So you're allowed to be part of the conversation and you're allowed to observe it as well. We're going to do a fishbowl and then use that as a way to set the direction for the next couple of conversations. Who do we want to invite? How do we want to focus the conversation around these topics of crisis, social transformation, and power? That, I think, is the format. Anything you want to add, Lana?
Oh, you've covered it quite well, Chris, and thank you. I'm so excited to be here again and looking forward to what will pop up, what would emerge from today's conversation.
All right. So welcome back, everyone. And I hope that helped you all settle and feel like you now have some warm friends within the GRLI. We talked to the GRLI network about what topics were important to discuss in this round of crucial conversations. 3 topics came back, and they were crisis, as in the crisis, the meta crisis, the multiple crises that we're in at the moment, the issue of power, where it lies, who holds it, and how it's used, and the issue of systemic transformation. And we had a choice about whether we broke those up and had a session on each, because we knew we were having 3 sessions and there were 3 topics. But we decided that there might be something really interesting in looking at the relationship between those 3 things. So how does power operate in a crisis? Who grabs power? Who steps back? What types of power exacerbate a crisis? What types of power might help navigate a crisis? How is the crisis interacting with global transformation? Is it a spur to transformation? Is it a distraction from systemic transformation? And what is this systemic transformation? Is it transformation within the system, or is it transformation of the system into something very different? So we thought we'd stick with all 3 together, looking at the relationships between them. And we wanted to use you as our help in doing that, and helping you to help us shape where we go with the next 2 conversations. So this is almost like our starter for 10. Where do we start from with these questions? What do they evoke for us? What do we feel about them? Where do they take us? Who do we want to invite in to start the fishbowl discussions with us? Who might give us some catalytic intervention? So in order just to take us into this topic, we know that you're all incredible intellects, so we have no doubt that you can bring your rational mind to bear on these topics. But we wondered also whether there's other ways to view these subjects, whether there's a slightly more mythical way to look at them. Are we in a time that in future might be described as a pivotal, the kind of time that legends and myths are made of? Can we bring myth or poetry or some kind of right brain analysis into this? As a way to trigger that, I would like to read you a poem which I think speaks to these issues. It's called A Map to the Next World by an American poet called Joy Harjo, who is an indigenous American and was the poet laureate for 3 years. It's a long poem, so I have edited it down. A Map to the Next World by Joy Harjo. In the last days of the 4th world, I wished to make a map for those who would climb through the hole in the sky. My only tools were the desires of humans as they emerged from the killing fields, from the bedrooms and the kitchens. The map must be of sand and can't be read by ordinary light. It must carry fire to the next tribal town for renewal of spirit. In the legend are instructions on the language of the land, how it was we forgot to acknowledge the gift. Take note of the proliferation of supermarkets and malls, the altars of money. They best describe the detour from grace. Keep track of the errors of our forgetfulness. The fog steals our children while we sleep. We no longer know the names of the birds here, how to speak to them by their personal names. Once we knew everything in this lush promise. Our forgetfulness stalks us, walks the earth behind us, leaving a trail of paper diapers, needles, and wasted blood. You will travel through the membrane of death. You'll smell cooking from the encampment where our relatives make a fresh feast of deer meat and corn soup. They never left us. we abandon them for science. And when you take your next breath as we enter the fifth world, there will be no guidebook, no words that you can carry. You'll have to navigate by your mother's voice, by renewing the song she is singing. Fresh courage glimmers from the planets and lights the map printed with the blood of history, a map you will have to know by your intention, by the language of suns. When you emerge, note the tracks of the monster slayers, where they entered the cities of artificial life and killed what was killing us. You will see red cliffs. They are the heart. They contain the ladder. Then a white deer will greet you when the last human climbs from the destruction. We were never perfect, yet the journey we make together is perfect on this earth. Crucial to finding the way is this: there is no beginning and no end. You must make your own map. Okay, so we're going to move into breakout groups, and the encouragement is just to keep that distance from the topic that is encouraged by the poetic mind frame. Lana.
In the breakout group, you will have a few minutes to share what really came up for you in this provocation of making our own maps. What feeling came up? What thought or idea? Daria? So we'll have the breakout rooms open.
Enjoy.
How was that?
Very rich.
And perhaps we can just invite one or two voices from each group before we do the fishbowl. Just a bit more of a saying or impressions I would like to share.
Can I just ask, can the group see each other's chat notes that we were making? In our group, Lana made some very good notes as we went along, which we will incorporate. But since no one put up their hand yet, I've just been making my own kind of observational note, which I'm happy to put into the chat, just as my first 2 cents from what I've been hearing. As a reference to the 3 preliminary topics that were identified, it's very clear that a sober and informed understanding of Christ's seed is a crucial and required baseline for us to know how to navigate our way around the world. I'm not sure yet what to make of the topic of power and our relationship to that, but it's very clear from what I'm hearing that we need a practical understanding of the levers for systemic change, not just an academic one, and perhaps some more hands-on experiments where we act as systems, acknowledging that we are part of certain systemic barriers or enablers. The way in which we act within those contexts often play a role in transforming or redirecting those systems. Thanks, Sandra and Daria.
Thank you, John.
I cannot take any credit. I was just gathering all of Sandra's notes from the breakout room. We went into so many different places and spaces, thinking about directionality, thinking about the narratives and weaving the narratives with the acts of power, so to say. How do we use language lately, proactive language, pointing out how 2 very different statements can create very different senses of responsibility. Also, we were questioning the responsibility of corporate narratives and how different stories that we were sharing with each other intertwine with our narrative as a humanity, giving a little bit of thought with very particular initiatives that are out there tackling. Feel free to compliment. I definitely didn't do it justice with just a few keywords. But maybe there is some smaller bits that are interesting in the chat as well that you would enjoy.
It's just sensing where we are in the process. So we would be going into the fishbowl. And I'm wondering if we can incorporate parts of what's coming up next for us.
I just need people to raise their hands.
I'll do it like that. So in the fishbowl, we'll have 4 people sharing the space, sharing their thoughts. And whenever you feel called, like what Daria said, raise your hand and you will be spotlighted. And whenever you feel like you would want to step out already, also then, yeah, unmute yourself. And then we would know when somebody would want to step in and raise their hands again. And in the fishbowl, again, looking at the topics that we've convened for around power, systemic change, and global crisis. And what you've heard in the group a while ago, just sensing into that of what are you noticing that's what's next that we might invite in these conversations? What are the elements that we're not seeing that perhaps we need to also encourage or take forward with us? Are we even in that baseline understanding of systemic change and global crisis in the work that we're doing? If you are called to step into the fishbowl, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll have 4 people being spotlighted.
I'm sitting here thinking, but I'll be fine.
I know that one of the things that arose for me out of that conversation and the notes that I saw in chat are about of First Peoples or indigenous knowledge and skills, understandings of the natural rhythms and earth and planet and how we don't listen to those. I'm struck by how diminished and dismissed those people often are within the dominant paradigm in societies, that and also dismiss because of the economic power. It's the power question for me. I'm struck by the recognition of that need and the dismissal of it socio-politically, and certainly in my hemisphere works. So I wonder what that means for who we might invite, how we might take this forward, and so on. But that's a very personal perspective, and I'm conscious that it may not resonate for others.
I think it has to be related to power. I'm thinking of indigenous voices or different ways of knowing, different cultures of wisdom that already has been categorized. And that's part of the power. Listening to that group or that voice puts one in a certain category.
Oh, yeah.
Listening to Native American Indians, the voices are categorized. So I'm thinking in terms of then what's next is how to remove labels, because then the associations with the labels are not there. And therefore it's more, what has somebody said? What was that idea that was actually probably very good to someone who was doing the labeling? So I think to me, the 2 elements there that are on top of mind are the power of creating that label or removing it, and also the crisis that is because we're not listening to what is said, but who said it or how it was said and what it was called. I was at the doctor and you should take statins. I'm like, I'm not going to take anything like this. And I don't need to. I know what my body is saying. I can tell from what I ate the night before how I feel in the morning. I know what was good or what was not. Even the doctor was surprised. He said, how do you know? You just have to listen. So I think somehow the noticing and the listening is both a crisis and an opportunity. So that's what you inspired for me, is really, let's remove labels. Let's look at the words and the wisdom.
I also said it in the chat earlier. I think the power is the one concept I'm struggling most to get my head around in this conversation, and I suspect it's probably because it is the one that's essential and difficult to crack. Your suggestion around either labeling or not, or removing labels as a means of, brought to mind for me the power of questions, right? So in other words, being in relationship to questions to which no one has a clear and definite answer, and somehow enabling such questions to be co-owned in a context where various power figures or power systems may otherwise be in competition with each other or overpowering each other. And maybe what I'm looking for in saying that is a way of diminishing existing relationships to power or breaking those down and establishing a different and more collaborative to ground that more practically. It may look like acknowledging this is the lay of the land. Here's what the data tells us. Here's what the evidence suggests. And if we broadly accept that, but also accept that we do not necessarily know exactly what to do about it, then let us co-create the questions we need to be holding to move us forward or navigate the current context.
You can go and somebody come in, that would be great. But I do have a response, John, to what you just said before you go. As you were talking, I was thinking about age-old definitions that sprang to mind about power, and very simplistically, forgive me, but it is the difference between power over and power to. And for me, I'm still stuck with you must make your own map, because I must make my own map. I must be, as BJ said, personally responsible for how I act and how I am in the world. But also, to have power to effect change, to have an impact, I do need the other. The other is essential. But it is also, there's something about knowing or sensing what it is, what is the real essential contribution that will have an impact beyond the self, that will shift the dominant narrative that we appear to be moving into. At the moment, I feel there's a lot of power over, and I'm not sure how to shift that apart from with others. Yeah, that's my contribution. And I'm also very happy if anybody wishes to tap me out, then please feel free to do.
Someone in the notes said something about the inner development goals. This for me presents an example of the challenge that I'm experiencing, which is, and I've said this on LinkedIn and other places before, I'm finding it particularly challenging because it's another labeling system, very well intentioned, but very opportunistic in the sense that we're dealing with the SDGs practically that we're not meeting. Now we're inventing another framework that, quite frankly, 95% of the world cannot afford to even engage with because many people are not meeting their basic needs or are indirectly affected by us not meeting the SDGs. I don't know whether that's another power play because how if we're dealing with poverty, inequality, gender, the issues that we're dealing with, and are we putting something else on top of that?
I was going to suggest that, John. Can I change the rules? Instead of waiting for someone to come in and say, I'd like to take your place, we can nominate someone.
Yes, please.
Yeah, that would be good.
We're a small group, so I think we can get into an agreement. There you go. This conversation, John and I, we share the sentiments around inner development goals and have been in exchange in around like what you said a while ago, Kathleen. There's just another way of labeling. It's another way of categorizing. And I like the question of how might we be able to remove the labels so that we can listen and tune in well. And it's so interesting because there's this co-ownership in the work that we've been doing with the hum in terms of, okay, how can we decentralize organizations? How can we help this work of redistributing power can really come from a place of privilege. It's easy for us to step into these spaces of, hey, let's look at How can we create organizations that looks at power within a power and lens, and not just even just a power with, but power and lens, when we can afford to, when we are able to. And in what the John mentioned already, if like in a majority of parts of the world, the redistribution of power is not even in the conversations because they have not even felt what power is for them. How might we redefine what power means in this society that we have right now? Power that comes from within and that we can act on collectively as well.
There's so much insight, but I'll stick to one. Two things on that, which is since we're talking about narratives, since we're talking about power, since we're talking about labels, then what I feel what's important here is to accept that narratives are there, whether in nature or elsewhere, and that we need to get hold of those narratives. They're all floating around. And the problem becomes when I want to look at a given narrative from a monocultural point of view. I want to interpret it, understand, intervene. The officer about whom I was talking in my breakout group was an officer who was educated and born, brought up elsewhere, who just walked in this part of the country, which is all tribal, indigenous communities. And nobody in the village had a watch. And this man said, no, you're not as human as I think you ought to be unless you carry a watch and stick to it. The problem was in the idea or the narrative he tried imposing on them. He represents that monoculture which says there's only one time and there is only one idea of that time, and there cannot be alternate. Labeling is as natural. I will be able to comprehend, understand, and respond to somebody who is the other only when I have labeled, say, so and so who belongs to this. Labeling per se is not a problem. The problem is that we tend to stick to certain labels and we're not open to listening to other labels. Then it becomes a problem and a power play between the monoculture and the plural, one label versus the other. And then I start undermining so many other labels around me, which I locate are subordinate, inferior, subjugated to my more powerful. So whether it's a corporation or government or a head of a nation, it gets difficult when one wants to impose one idea, one culture, one narrative. If you're intending to have a peaceful, meaningful life, we need to understand that there are these multiple versions. Each one of them is as respectable as mine. I need to negotiate between these narratives. So do I have the necessary skills, tools, methods to be able to negotiate, understand what are the competing memes, competing narratives, and negotiate between them? The skill I need as a decision maker is that capability to figure out those competing narratives and negotiate between them to the extent possible and allow multiple narratives to stay as they are.
Thank you. I've jumped in just because we're nearing the end of our time. So I was going to suggest that we give Sandra the final word and then we wrap up. Sandra.
I agree with Rohit. We need multiple stories. The thing is, they need to be co-created. If I is thinking about what it wants to do next, then one thought would be to bring different actors together in a setting like this where no one's status is clear and have them co-create not one story, but new, the broad outlines of the story, if you will. The new narrative is one of what the emerging narrative for me is an eco-social narrative, ecological and social. It's not just about humans, but it's about humans in the context of other than human beings, that as part of nature, not as separate from nature. And that's a very old story. And for many of us in Western cultures, it's a very new story, may already have them. So that we develop a whole series of contextually relevant stories that are applicable, but broadly based, I think, on a set of core values that are widely shared, like justice, inclusion, and ecological flourishing.
Thank you. Great. Daria, could you remove the spotlights and maybe bring us all back in? Our time is almost up. I have found that incredibly rich. The breakout groups just blew my mind. Harvesting that back in the fishbowl was a great rehearsal for our next couple of meetings. We're just saying our goodbyes. If people want to drop anything in the chat, I was struck by John's bringing in questions, the power of questions. As you're leaving, what question are you left with that might help us pick up next time? So what's the question that you're leaving with? And we might be able to harvest those to think about where we go next. If you have any thoughts about people who would be good to join us next time, invited guests to catalyze the discussion. So who might have a different narrative? Who might help us shape a narrative of an eco-social society? It would be great if you can drop that in the chat. We have a short poem to leave you with as we go. John, is there anything, or Daria, anything that you'd like to say from the GRLI end as a way to say goodbye?
Just to thank you.
The poem will be the perfect closing.
All right. Thanks to everybody for showing up today and for bringing yourselves to the discussion, your whole selves to the discussion. It feels like we've reached a depth of understanding that I haven't heard before in this kind of setting. It felt like quite a shared sense as well, which really struck me. So thank you very much for that. We're going to close with a poem that Lana chose, but I think you want me to read it. Is that right? Okay. And it's by Rumi, and it's called we've lost the title.
A Great Wagon.
Great Wagon. Yeah. And it goes like this, and you'll recognize parts of it from Rumi. Today, like every other day, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't open the door to the study and begin reading. Take down a musical instrument. Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other no longer make any sense. The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the doorsill where the two worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't.
Invite others in the conversation.
Yeah, please do invite us.
Thank
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Chris, Lana.
Great to see you.
you.